Wind moves over a badlands ridge and the ground seems empty until a curve of bone catches light. The skull is long, almost absurdly so, and the jaws look like the snout of a crocodile grafted to a running animal. Teeth gleam in neat shearing rows, the nose stretches forward like a spear, and the brain case behind it is small compared to the engine room of that bite. Most people walk past such a fossil without a name to attach to it. They know saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, and tyrannosaurs. They rarely know the hunter that ruled long before a modern lion ever roared. Yet in the Eocene and Oligocene landscapes of North America, Europe, and Asia, a lineage called hyaenodonts, and at times their even larger relatives such as Sarcastodon in Central Asia, were the deadliest land predators you have probably never heard of. Their reign begins after the last non-avian dinosaurs, when forests and open woodlands covered much of the continents, when climate was warm and then cooling, and when mammals were busy trying every design the world would allow. Out of that experimentation came a group of predators that were not true carnivores as we classify them today. They were creodonts, an early branch of mammal meat-eaters. Among them, hyaenodonts perfected a head built for tearing and a body suited to long pursuit. Imagine an animal with the shoulder height of a large wolf or a small lion in the smaller species, and the weight and bulk of a big cat or even a bear in the largest. Imagine a skull so elongated that the distance from nose to ear looks out of proportion to the rest of the body. Along that skull, the teeth form a conveyor belt of slicing blades. Instead of one pair of carnassials like cats and dogs, these hunters carried several pairs of shearing teeth, a battery that could keep cutting even as one set wore down. Their name misleads. Hyaenodon sounds like hyena, but they were not hyenas, and their teeth were not built for cracking bone as a main strategy. They could snap and splinter when needed, but the core of their toolkit was slicing. Their jaws opened wide and shut with a fast scissor action. The temporalis muscles that powered the close were anchored on broad crests, and the jaw joint sat low and tight, keeping the motion in a plane. When a hyaenodont clamped down and pulled its head back, hide and muscle parted like cloth under sharp shears. In the sediments of Wyoming, in the chalk and marl of France, in Mongolian deserts where wind writes lines across dunes, bones of prey show the signatures of these jaws. Rib ends are shaved clean at angles, vertebral spines are clipped, long bones carry grooves that run parallel where teeth slid as the head tugged. The predators themselves left skulls that tell a clear story. The nasal bones are long. The muzzle hosts long-rooted premolars and molars that sharpened against each other. The postcanine rows create a cutting surface that marches back farther than in dogs or cats. The brain case is not tiny, but it is not enlarged for complex social planning either. The sense of smell was primary, the vision good enough, the hearing tuned to medium and low frequencies carried in forest and open scrub. What did they hunt? The record of their world includes nimble artiodactyls that would one day give rise to deer and antelope, early horses that moved in small herds and shifted from browsing to grazing as grasslands spread, tapir-like browsers in damp corridors, and rooting pig relatives exploring edges and floodplains. In Asia and parts of Europe, enormous rhinoceros kin wandered, some hornless and barrel-bodied, some long-limbed and fast. Rodents had diversified into forms that filled burrows and tree branches and ground cover. There were primates in warm forest belts. There were the last of the great running birds in some regions, huge ratites that could kick and sprint. It was a complex prey field. The hyaenodonts that thrived within it were not all the same size or temperament, but the big ones sat at the top of the pyramid. If you hold the skull of a large species, the length strikes you first. In Hyaenodon gigas, the skull is a predatory beam. In Sarcastodon, known from Mongolia, the head is both long and deep, with muscle scars that run like welds. The neck vertebrae are stout, a sign that the head swung like a hammer. The forelimbs are not cat-like grappling devices, but straight, strong pillars suited to running and bracing, while the head did the final work. The spine is flexible enough for a gallop, but does not advertise cheetah-like bursts. These animals were built for covering ground, detecting, closing, and committing, not for dancing around a corner with quick paw strikes. In a warm Eocene morning, a small herd of three-toed horses browsed near a stream that had shrunk back from its spring stage. Leaves hung low, hides twitched against flies, and the air smelled of water and sap. A hyaenodont came upwind. It did not hug the ground like a cat. It trotted with the confidence of a hunter that relies on closing speed and on a bite that ends argument. When the herd spooked and broke, the predator chose a juvenile, one that had delayed half a stride on the wrong side of a sapling. The chase was not long. The cut was a diagonal rush that aimed at the rear quarter. The jaws closed above the tendon of the thigh and sliced. The horse stumbled, the predator pivoted, and as the prey rolled, the hyaenodont found the neck. It did not suffocate the animal as a lion does. It opened vessels and cut deep, then stepped back and waited as strength poured into the soil. That method leaves fewer broken canines and fewer crushed incisors. It is surgical. It is also risky if the prey is large and armored. Hyaenodonts in turn scaled their attacks to match. In some bone beds where large rhinoceros kin dominate the herbivore roster, hyaenodont remains are fewer and larger. The scraps of their tooth wear suggest they took young and weak animals, and they scavenged with authority. They could drive off smaller carnivores not only by strength but by the simple terror of a long skull coming low over a carcass and cutting like a saw through ligaments. To understand why they ruled, it helps to look at their competition. The meat-eaters we know as carnivorans, the group that includes dogs, cats, bears, and hyenas, were present through much of this time, but many early forms were small to medium. They had nimble paws, shorter skulls, and different tooth rows that combined slicing with crushing. Their brains were proportionally larger in some lineages, their social patterns more flexible. But in open woodlands and early savannas of the late Eocene and early Oligocene, if a giant hyaenodont walked into view, the other carnivores yielded. In the same way that later saber-toothed cats would monopolize a kill through presence, these earlier scissor-jawed hunters enforced a hierarchy. The bones tell this without drama. On carcasses where hyaenodont tooth marks cover large muscle attachment points, dog-like and cat-like marks are scarce until the long blades have moved on. On others where small carnivores began the feast, long cut marks cross the earlier bites like a final signature. Their senses were tuned to this job. In well-preserved skulls, the turbinates, those bony shelves inside the nose that carry smell receptors, fill the nasal cavity. The long muzzle and large olfactory surfaces mean a life lived with scent. Vision seems to have been adapted to crepuscular and daylight hunts, with orbits not especially large. Their ears suggest sensitivity to rustle and footfall. Think of a hunter that knows from a ridge how many animals passed at dawn by reading the air as if it were a page, then moves to where the wind writes strongest. The young of these animals grew up fast enough to keep the lineage in play, yet they also took time to reach the size needed for the top roll. In growth, cross-sections of limb bones, rings, and vascular patterns show steady building, with pauses that match seasonal scarcity. Teeth erupt in sequences that match a pace between the sprint of small predators and the slow climb of bears. The adults healed from injuries that tell of bold lives, rib fractures smoothed, limb chips knit, and jaw edge nicks polished by later wear. In some assemblages, a healed bite mark on a hyaenodont bone matches the spacing of a smaller hyaenodont, a hint of fights or rough handling over meat. Sociality remains hard to prove. These were not wolf-like pack hunters in the modern sense, yet they were not solitary ghosts either. The distribution of ages in some deposits, with a few juveniles among several adults, suggests at least temporary associations or prolonged parental overlap. The shape of their world shifted under their feet. The Eocene held warm, forested belts where browsing dominated, then the Oligocene cooled and dried. Grasslands advanced in patches, river systems widened and carved basins into terraces that rose and fell with climate. When grasses came, teeth changed. Prey adapted with higher-crowned molars to withstand grit and the silica of blades. Speed increased in open patches. In the predators, change came in a more complex way. Some hyaenodont lineages grew larger, perhaps to hold their position as prey bodies broadened on grass diets. Others dwindled as carnivorans diversified into dog-like forms that could chase cooperatively, and cat-like forms that could vault from cover. The hyaenodont solution of a long muzzle and multiple slicing pairs remained effective, but it was specialized. It excelled at opening bodies, not at crunching all the scraps when times were lean. It excelled at individual commitment, not at organized chase with a dozen flanking partners. In a world where seasons swung harder and prey moved in larger, faster herds across wider ground, flexibility began to outscore dominance. The end of their rule is not one event in one valley. It is a long slope. In Europe, hyaenodonts decline as the climate cools and as large dog relatives learn to run in open country. In North America, their last strongholds fade as cats refine a more compact killing bite and as bears test omnivory at scale. In Asia, a few large forms hold on, Sarcastodon among them, trading on bulk and a skull that looks like a siege engine. But when you scan the record forward into the late Oligocene and Miocene, their signatures thin. Carnivorans take the top chairs. The deadly jaws become relics, then curiosities in sandstone and silt. Yet calling them obsolete misses the force of their success. They owned their time. For millions of years, they were the answer to the question the land asked. How do you turn a forest and scrubland of nimble herbivores into the calories needed to make a large predator thrive? You build a head that is mostly tool. You set a conveyor of slicing teeth into that head. You tie the tool to a neck and shoulders that can anchor the pull. You keep the paws simple and reliable for running and bracing. You organize your senses around smell and the reading of ground and air. You commit to the bite. That design worked so well that when later people finally traced the lines of their skulls from rock, they had to invent a name that fell back on the nearest familiar animal, even though it fit poorly. Hyaenodon, the hyena tooth, an echo rather than a description. Even today, if you visit a museum drawer and slide out a tray with one of their skulls, the impression is immediate. The canines are not oversized trophies. They are the lead edges of a series of butcher blades. The molars are not rounded crushers. They are shelves aligned to meet and pass like the blades of shears. The jaw closes in a track. The joint is a hinge, not a swivel built for play. Along the palate, grooves and ridges suggest tough flesh worked over and over, not the occasional dainty nibble. The front teeth, the incisors, are small, because delicate plucking was not their job. The long rostrum makes space for the tool. The brain case sits back like a knot where tendons attach. You can build a scene from these parts and keep it honest. A bone bed of small horses and pig relatives lies near a low ridge with mixed woodland. The season was dry. Some bodies died of want and were thinned by scavengers. Others were taken while the herd crossed a gap between shrubby pockets. On the long bones of the necked horses, the cut marks say the big muscles were stripped first, then the dorsals opened, then the limbs defleshed. On some bones, the angles of cut align with a head pulling from front to back, not from side to side. Scent carried the news. A second predator arrived, a dog-like carnivoran, and worked the leftovers. Its tooth marks overlay the earlier cuts at different depths, a palimpsest of hunger. A day later, the wind shifted, and a dust fall sealed the layer with a thin film. In another year, floodwater ripped the same bank and added a new set of bodies, older and heavier in the lower elements. Lighter and younger drifted up on the bar. The long modern story is that a person came with a shovel and brush and took careful notes. The older story is that an animal you may never have heard of wrote its name in a way that took patience to read. Why should that reading matter now? Because our sense of what a land predator is has been narrowed by fame. Lions and wolves are easy to admire. Tyrannosaurs are easy to fear in imagination. Between those bookends lies a library of designs that show different answers to the same problem. Hyaenodonts remind us that you can be deadly without being familiar. They show that a cutting engine can dominate a world if the world is set for that engine. They show that success is time-bound. They also warn, in their decline, that specialization is a bargain. When the land asks a new question, a tool built only for the old answer becomes an heirloom rather than a weapon. There is one more reason, and it sits beyond names and teeth. Learning to see a predator that lacks celebrity trains the eye to look at evidence rather than its story. A long groove on a rib is not dramatic until you match it to a tooth row and find it fits like a key. A small jaw fragment with a single premolar is not impressive until you set it into a grid of measurements and see a pattern that maps a population through time. A stack of tooth enamel powders is not exciting until the isotope ratios sort themselves into seasons, and you watch drought run a saw blade through the lives of a herd and the days of the hunter that followed it. The deadliest land predator you have never heard of earns your attention because it proves, quietly and completely, that the past does not need a spotlight to be strong. It only needs a reader. Stand again with the wind on that ridge and look across a valley cut by time. There is no roar. There is no chase you can film. There is only a curve of bone that was once an edge, and the knowledge that thousands of edges like it closed and opened and closed again, turning life into life for a span of years longer than our species has existed. That is enough to make a name matter, and enough to make forgetting it a small loss that we can repair with the simple work of learning. When you walk away, you will carry a picture in your head of an animal low and sure, with a long head and a purpose-built mouth. It belonged to a world that asked for decision over drama, and it gave that decision again and again. It was deadly in the exact way its land required. If the name slips, the shape will remain, and the next time a shaft of light catches a tooth in stone, you will know you are not looking at a footnote but at a headline from a forgotten age, written in enamel, muscle, and time.